So,
oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, say what you're going to say. That's fine.
We're just fine. Been a long time. I'm going to say this. It's been one of those days.
Yeah.
You know, weekends, spring break.
Who's the hotter bod persona? Obviously me. Debate over.
Jake. It's Jake.
Tell me about spring break, Mr. Teacher.
It was last week, but you know, today it's a Saturday, so I'll usually get up and I'll go through a bunch. I won't go through my normal routine, but what I end up doing is I end up doing some yard work, doing some other stuff. Maybe I'll work out. And I always have like workout is going to be in there somewhere. It wasn't there today. And then it gets to the end of the day and my wife's like, hey, have you showered today? And I'm like, well, I had nowhere that I needed to go to be showered. So I haven't yet.
Oh, good.
Doesn't mean I won't. I'm just,
I bet she really appreciated it though. Like she got your natural musk kind of wafting through the house. I'm sure she
certainly.
Yeah.
Certainly.
No, that's good. I'm glad to hear it.
The Wandering Historian says it's bedtime there. See, I'm telling you, it's.
Yeah, no, you're right. We started too late. Our East Coast audience, they're already in bed.
East Coasters.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. So here we are. This is Dad Bod History, and what are you pointing at, Jake?
I was going to say I went viral this past week.
I know you did.
I make all these well-crafted videos about history, and then I do one throwaway video about the internet in the 90s, and boom, it takes me over 1,000 followers, which is awesome. I love it. It was so fun seeing the comments because it was basically 60 or 70% of the comments were other millennials like us saying, oh yeah, I remember growing up in the 90s. I remember doing the dial-up, AOL Instant Messenger or AOL Instant Messenger and hooking up with the modem. And I loved it. It was awesome. But then there was like 10 or 20%, which was just clearly Gen Xers who were angry that I didn't talk about how much more real and hardcore the internet was in the 80s. Like saying, oh, you actually had to put your phone on the modem. Or we had BBS bulletin board services. It's like,
nobody had that in their house.
Yeah.
Right? It's
apparently these guys did because they built their computer out of scraps in their garage.
No, those are not, that's not a generation that grew up with that. Those are very specialized, very specific hobbyists and specialists who did that. That's not, no, sorry.
And that's the thing.
It's not a generation.
That's what made AOL so unique. And I understand there was other services. There was Netscape. There was Juno. I understand that. But AOL, remember Juno? My mom had Juno. We're using Juno or Net Zero. Remember when the internet was free? That was all their thing. What's my favorite war? I'll get to that question. But I think and what people said is like, oh, well, you know, the internet, you had to do this. And you had to hook up to like BBSs, which is bulletin board services. And those are like basically you had to dial into this specific phone number and you could buy or sell things on there. Or you could have like, it was like the ancestor of like massive multiplayer online RPGs, MMO RPGs, right? But it was all text based. And I think that's so cool. Like, I think it's awesome. It's like AOL, man.
Juno.
When that came in,
dude,
that was for
this
everybody.
Logo of Juno, dude, that brings back memories, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, man, you just said something and I lost it.
Yeah, talking about the MMOs.
I remember dialing up in the late 90s, mid 90s, late 90s, dialing up to play Myth and Myth 2 with my buddies.
Yeah.
But no, my really good friend Bobby, I remember he had AOL and I remember the conversation before my family got it was the fact that he was up every night on it and they charged by the minute.
Yeah.
And he was on there for hours on end over the entire month and they had this massive bill, right? So
that's the trick, man. AOL. So you had to get those discs, the floppy disks originally, and then the CDs, and they'd say like 500 hours of free AOL because they charged by the minute. And then it wasn't until it was maybe 96 or 97, maybe it was 95, but then they were able to do like the flat rate. And that way you could, and he's just ignoring me now, which is fine.
No, I see the wandering historian's
like
question.
1995 or you could do it for $19.95 a month. And that broke the servers though. So many people logged up for that flat rate of unlimited AOL. It broke the servers. Anyway, to your second question, Wandering Historian, I don't know if it's my favorite, but I think it's very cool. And I've done a video on this in the past, is I have this Christmas card. And it's very old. And it's from, well, I'll show you. But it's got the American flag and it's got the Hungarian flag on it. And then if you open it, it's got this beautiful picture of Budapest, Hungary. And it says, "Best thanks from the Hungarian children for your kind Christmas presents. We have made many little ones happy with them. God bless you." And that says Xmas, not Christmas, 1914. And I don't know if you guys were aware of what happened in 1914, around this time in Christmas in Hungary. But World War I had kicked off. This is a Christmas card that is actually for my wife's family. So it's not mine personally. But it's this Christmas card. Her grandmother, when she was a child, like their family would send gifts and send packages to people back in Europe. And so they sent some gifts to an orphanage in Hungary. And then the children had this Christmas card, and it's signed by the then Count Stephen Tietze, who was the prime minister of Hungary at this time. And then inside there's an insert of the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yep. And then his grandson, Joseph Otto, who became the last crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it's just wild that this Christmas card was sent at the beginning of World War I, and how drastically things changed for the empire by the end of 1918. And I just think it's fascinating. It's not, I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's a piece of history that I find very, very enjoyable to look at and share.
So I have a few pieces of history, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of I don't want to grab that right now. So I'm looking at something over this direction. It's hanging on my wall, and it is, I don't know how many coins it is, probably 30 coins that my dad found at the farmhouse that he grew up at, which was in New York. The house he grew up at had been a fort that was used in the 18th century.
Sure.
And so he found all these coins from as late as the 1920s to as early as the late 1700s. And it's a bunch of coins. He found them, he had collected them, and then he made this frame for them, and then he glued them to the wood.
Good. That's how you should do.
He glued these coins to the wood. Someday I'll take it to Antiques Roadshow, and they'll be like, it would be worth this much, but they were glued to the wood, so they're worth.
Maybe it didn't glue them to the wood. Yeah.
No, they're pretty well fastened. But here's what I have. This is for my grandmother. This is something she had, and this is if you see that there, that's the insignia of the Air Force, and it is a book on the 8th Air Force. And this book, it's very fragile. It's falling apart. At the front page, it says Sergeant Norma D. Johnson, Control Tower Operator, Lockbourne Air Force Base, B-17 Training Base. So Sergeant Norma D. Johnson is my grandmother's sister. My grandmother was also a sergeant. They worked together. And this is a book that the 8th Air Force put together. The date that this was published was in 1943.
Oh, yeah, Wandering Historian served under them.
Oh. Well, that's awesome. So my grandmother trained radio operators in the Air Force. And of course, this is all about, it's all about their campaigns in Europe prior to 1943. like they published this book before the war was over. The binding has completely failed, so all these pages are coming out. But they have, stories and pictures of all this stuff from the first few years of the 8th Air Force in the European theater. So it's a cool book to have. I'd say the other piece goes back to 1914, Jake, is I have 2 letters from a brother who's serving in the American Army during World War I, actually after World War I. Both letters are dated 1919. And they were found by somebody that I know and given to me. I don't know where they came up with them, so I don't know the people involved. The language in these 2 letters is a little bit startling because it's has derogatory language in that he's referencing African-American soldiers who are part of the occupying force or the force that's still left in France. It's very interesting to read these letters about, what they're doing in France, kind of what their job is now. So, all right, Wandering Historian is off, and if he can come back, he'll come back. So, I have those letters somewhere tucked away.
Yeah, it's funny when you talk about pieces of history. I have a pocket watch for my dad, and that pocket watch was built. It was made in 1873, long before it got into my dad's hand, and then it was engraved for a man in 1893, and then it traveled from there, all the way to my dad, and then to me. I think when you look at history like that, and you see those small pieces, that's what makes it special to me. Like, it's fun reading about battles and big events and watching movies and stuff like that, but like, it's everywhere. Like, you can go anywhere and you can find a piece of history, and then it's amazing if you go far enough back, you can tie it to all these incredible events or places without having to have, like, you don't need a piece of the Berlin Wall necessarily to appreciate history, although it's cool if you do. But like, you don't like, and that's why, like, with this random postcard that my wife's grandmother got, or this pocket watch, or like the book from your grandmother. I think that's so indelible and so cool to see when it comes to history and how we appreciate it and enjoy it.
Yeah, I recently I've been reading some books, and one of the books I read, I have one of them here, is The Hemingses of Monticello. And the thing about it that I really enjoyed is something that I think we forget when we deal with history. We deal with history in these broad strokes. We talk about all the enslaved people. We talk about the slave owners, plantation owners, Southerners, as if they are one, like
a monolith.
And this is, I really enjoyed it because it's these people, Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings, James Hemings, they're all these individuals, and they all play these different parts. And, we always kind of go back and forth. Thomas Jefferson, good or bad? You can't just say they're good or bad, but Thomas Jefferson, he had a way of treating these people that he was related to, that he was also enslaving, a very interesting way. And all of these stories are really individual stories. Like, the life of Sally Hemings it cannot be summed up with she was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. That is true, but there's so much more to it. And it's hard to talk about these big moves in history, the big movements, once you start to read individual stories, because then you're like, well, what was true was partly true for this person, but their experience was different than all of the other experiences.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring that up is because the other book is Mission at Nuremberg, which is it's about Henry Gorecki, the Lutheran chaplain who was assigned to 17 of the men on trial. He was assigned as their chaplain. And you want to go to the other direction of, well, can we treat these men as individuals can we treat this chaplain as an individual doing what he thinks is right by offering, you know, some certain amount of dignity to the people who had offered it to nobody else.
Yeah.
So that's one I have to get into. Haven't gotten into it yet.
I agree. It's interesting you bring up the Hemmings because I did a short video and somebody asked about the poster behind me. And this is a poster of Madison.
Yes, right?
In the 1860s. And as I was giving this, you know, I'll just turn it a little bit. But as I was kind of explaining, you know, you can see the Capitol here, the university over here, here's the lakes, and then there's the Rasdale House here. And I kind of, as an aside, I threw it away and I said, oh, the Hemmings lived in Madison, or a couple of her grandchildren lived in Madison, and their history with Madison is they ran the Rasdale House, and they also ran this other hotel, so they were hotel operators, and they were able to do that in Wisconsin. They went from like Virginia to I think Ohio, and then they immigrated to Wisconsin. And these particular kids, and I don't remember their names, and I can't look it up because my phone is on here, but they were able to pass.
Eston Hemmings.
Yes.
He was
Eston
her son.
And so Eston and then his two sons ran the Rasdale House. But they passed for white. And so that's why they were even, like we'd like to think of like in the 1860s when this map was printed, in 1867, that they could pass for white. And that's why they were able to successfully own and operate these businesses within Madison, which was considered a Union city. In an anti-slavery state. But, and I think Eston's two sons, they both served in the Union, and one of them rose to like lieutenant colonel in the Union in the Civil War. And so when we talk about like the Hemmings or any of these stories, like if we just focus on what happened with Jefferson, and it's like the story doesn't end with Jefferson. The story continues. And it continues in places that you would never expect. But if you look, you can see that story. And I think that's one of my favorite things I've discovered, as I look at things in my hometown, is like, no, there's Hemmings here. And they built a life here. And then their descendants
live there. Yeah, it's wild because you say he's white passing. It was John Wales Jefferson. That was Eston Hemmings' son. Yeah. And he served as a I don't know what rank it was, a colonel.
I think it was a colonel.
Colonel in the Northern Army during the Civil War, in the Union Army. And by the painting, you wouldn't guess that he would have been, I think it would have been 1/16 African American, because Sally Hemings was
pale, light red hair.
Sally Hemings was at most half. She may have been a quarter.
She was a quarter African American,
and so it dilutes within a generation or two, but Thomas Jefferson was keeping Sally enslaved, and her brothers enslaved, and they were Thomas Jefferson's deceased wife's siblings. They were sibling-in-laws to him. And
that's why John Wales Jefferson, his name is very specific. So because John Wales was Sally's father or grandfather.
It was Sally's and Martha's his deceased wife,
so
their father.
And he took the name Jefferson because he was a Hemmings, but then I think he took the name Jefferson. And that's all very tying back. Like it was a nod to his family, his Jefferson side, without saying, I am a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. It was a nod to that. And I think it's fascinating when you look at it that way too.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. And I found it very, it was a good experience to read these very particular individual stories, because I think I am guilty of putting slavery and everyone who was enslaved just kind of into this group. And it's just easy to lump them all together. It's easy to lump all the plantation owners together. but man, they all had different experiences, and how they, you know, understanding that slavery is just at its base is brutal and demeaning and dehumanizing. Yeah. Everyone who owned people treated them based on their own individual experience. And Thomas Jefferson treated anyone who was a Hemmings differently than he treated anyone the other 130 people that he owned. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was a good read. I enjoyed it.
Wandering Historian, can you join the live now that you're back, or no? We'll wait for that answer. Oh, there he is. Maybe.
Trying to see if I can get my camera to work.
Well, there you go. I've invited you to. There it is.
So we can see him.
First off, name is Evan.
Hey, Evan.
Well, I'm Eric. That's Jake.
Pleasure to meet you. And Eric's the hot one, right?
No. My wife says so, but no.
So
piercing blue eyes.
That's all I have going for me.
I used to have hair going for me, but
yeah.
So the piece of history that I own, it's actually not here. It's at my office, and I have to bring it back because my office it had a small electrical fire this weekend, apparently. So needs to be taken out of there. But I realize that I'm at a bit of an advantage over people because of my position. I am an active civilian who works for the Air Force full-time as a historian. And my first assignment was in Okinawa with the 18th Wing. Mm-hmm. So on top of walking up and down about 20 some odd % of the battlefield for Okinawa, we also were charged with going to Iwo Jima and leading a group at SON called a primary military education to Iwo Jima. So I got to do that 6 times.
Oh, wow.
Oh, the wow factor is the buddy I know doesn't measure his time on Iwo in hours or days, but in months. He is easily the world's expert on Iwo Jima. He knows where all the little hidey holes everything is.
Yeah.
But I had spent most of my Army life looking for a brass 105 shell casing. They were incredibly rare, and they're hard to find because they were phased out around the Vietnam-era war. So they can't find them anymore. On my 5th trip to Iwo Jima, I kicked something I thought was a rock. It turns out, after I unveiled it and took it out of the earth, it is a battle-used 105 shell casing from the Battle of Iwo Jima.
And that's artillery, right?
Yes.
That's an artillery size.
5mm artillery. It was, I believe it was either Echo or Fox battery of one of the Marine companies because it was about 20, 30 meters away from the firing point.
Uh-huh.
And so that is the coolest piece of history that I actually own.
That's pretty cool.
Well, if we're going to talk about artillery.
Oh, my gosh.
So here's the other piece I was thinking about. So I don't know if you can see that. That is a battery, right? A company-sized unit. And it says Battery A, 880th Field Artillery, Camp Shelby, Mississippi, December 1943. Mm-hmm. This is a reproduction. My dad has the actual photo. And off in the far right corner, right there. Oh, where did I lost him? Right there is my dad's uncle Russ. And they called him the Silver Fox because he was, I think, 36 years old. He was the oldest man in the battery, like oldest man in the regiment.
Yeah,
World War II.
And so they were attached to the 69th Infantry Division. He was at Potsdam at the end of the war. And I have a bunch of pictures from him. So, yeah, I don't know everything that he did, but it was artillery. And artillery's fun.
Hey, that's something.
Yep, king of battle. And I was artillery for 8 years of my army life.
Wasn't Albert artillery?
Albert was, yeah.
You don't know Albert Slucher, by the way, do you?
Yeah, you know Albert. The army is so small, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah, there's only about 1 million of us for sure.
You probably know
Albert and I go way back.
Yeah, First Sergeant Albert. Everybody knows him.
Although, funny story is I occasionally work with the 7th Infantry Division, and I help them write a couple articles about their Battle of Attu and Battle of Okinawa, because It's kind of funny. They were the first offensive ground units to fight against the Imperial Japanese in World War II, and they were some of the last offensive ground units to fight against the Japanese in World War II. So it's a really interesting full circle for them. But I walked in there to meet their new PAO and talk to him, and we kind of look at each other. You look really familiar. You do. Turns out we had gone to what's called Officer's Basic Course and then Captain's Career Course together in artillery. And
wow.
Years and years later, here we are, opposite sides of the Joint Base Lewis McChord.
That's awesome.
So you said 7th Infantry, right?
7th Infantry.
So I do recognize this insignia. Now, I know that, or I'm under an assumption that most of the fighting in the Pacific was the Marines, but the Army was involved, especially in the Philippines, early on.
Yes. The Army was the sole ground fighting units in the Battle of Attu, which was primarily Attu and Kiska in Alaska. And then they were contributing units dotted throughout the Pacific, but mostly focused on the Philippines and Okinawa.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So they defended Alaska.
They actually had to go in and retake Alaska.
Okay.
And the Japanese landed soldiers on the Aleutian Islands.
Yeah,
that's where Attu and Kiska is.
Yeah.
You can actually go visit. There's like a weird star-shaped monument on it too. You can go visit, and there was actually a Medal of Honor awarded for that. Private Joe Martinez, who was both the first person from Colorado to receive the medal and the first Mexican American in America to receive the medal in World War II.
Huh.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my forte is I have a weird thing about Medal of Honor recipients, so I really study them for some random reason. I don't know why.
Well, you know who the first Medal of Honor recipient is, correct?
It was a Civil
Jake
War.
knows.
It was a Civil War. At the time, it was really considered a medal.
It was that train robbery.
Yeah.
They did the failed train robbery. It was like,
that's right. Some great raid. Oh,
yeah. They stole this train from the Confederates, but everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Like the conductor chased them on one of those push cart things, and
there is a Disney movie about it.
Is there?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm almost certain.
I'm sure. Yeah. No. Yeah. I can't remember what it was, but yeah, and it was everything about it just went wrong, but they created the medal during the Civil War, and these guys, I can't remember their names, but they were the first. It was 16 of them, the first recipients, and a couple of them got it posthumously because they did not make it.
Andrews Raiders.
Yes, Andrews Raiders.
Big Shanty, the train in Big Shanty, Georgia.
Yep.
In truth, the Medal of Honor actually wasn't created in the Civil War.
Oh, wasn't it?
The way we know it now, yes, but originally, if you go back to the badge of military merit in the Revolutionary War that George Washington created, which would later become the predecessor to both the Medal of Honor and the Purple Heart because of its design as being a Purple Heart with merit written to it.
Uh-huh.
But he wanted to give it to anybody of all rank, and he gave it to 2 sergeants. Gosh darn it, their names are eluding me. But one of them was directly involved with the capture of Benedict Arnold, and that's one of the reasons he got it. The other one was a spy, a long-term spy for George Washington. And that's one of the reasons. But he wanted to create a medal that would go blankly across all ranks in the Army. And so he created the Badge of Military Merit. It was a choker, essentially, that went around their neck, and it was a Purple Heart that said merit in white writing on it.
Oh, yeah. It looks like the Purple Heart, except it says merit. Interesting.
Yep. Hello, those that have joined. Thank you for joining. But then in the Civil War, it was that's when it became the Congressional Medal of Honor. Then, so that's what changed it. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
And speaking of that, if you guys are anywhere near South Carolina, in late May, the Congressional Medal of Honor Society is going to be reopening their Medal of Honor Museum.
Okay. Where's this? South Carolina?
Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay. I was trying to find it. I couldn't. I moved the book. There's a book. I can't remember the name of it, but it's about that Japanese invasion of the Aleutian Islands. It's called Ghosts something.
Yeah, there's a couple books out there.
And It's not super long, but it's a fascinating story because it's one of those things like when we talk about World War II, most people don't know that the Japanese actually did land soldiers on American soil. You know, they think, well, the raid on Pearl Harbor and then that was it. But like, no, this happened. I mean, in Alaska, and I can't remember the name of it.
Another good one to look up is things about Cold Bay, because when the 7th was getting pulled out of there, the 10th mountain before it went to Europe was elements of the 10th mountain went up to Alaska.
Yeah.
So you got to remember the Japanese are also the last foreign enemy before 9/11 to kill American civilians on American soil.
Yeah. Yeah. It's anyway.
All right, so I do want to go back to the first 2 questions I asked. What is your favorite war and favorite battle? Now, they don't have to be inside this. The battle does not have to be inside the war.
Okay.
It's
okay, I'll say it. I'll go.
Go ahead.
I think my favorite war to read about is the Persian Wars between Greece and the Persian Empire. And I think it is because when I was younger, I read the histories by Herodotus, and I understand he's a fabulist, and there's a lot of stuff that he just, exaggerates or makes up. But the way he wrote about not just the battles and especially Thermopylae, but like the whole history of the Persian Empire and all this context, and just kind of engrossed me. And so in that respect, I think it's probably my favorite conflict to read about. And with that, I don't know if the Battle of Thermopylae is my favorite battle, but I think the Persian Wars are definitely my favorite wars to read about. I'll have to think about the battle specifically. That might take a little longer. So if Eric, you want to jump in while I think?
I really don't. I don't like this question because I don't want to decide. I think it's just going to be World War II because that's the thing that I know the most about. Either that or World War One. But I'm not, it's something I've taught for 20 years, both of those wars. I think World War One is my favorite war. Maybe. The Russo-Japanese War, a couple years ago, we did some episodes on it. We got really deep into it. That is fascinating because...
that is an underappreciated war.
Completely overlooked by the people who were watching it unfold in front of their eyes, being like, this is interesting. If warfare goes
learned
this
all
way,
the wrong lessons.
It'll be very different. We're going to kick off our own war and ignore all the tactics we just witnessed. The fact that the largest battle in history occurred there up until that point and nobody blinked an eye, the Battle of Mukden. So it's such a fascinating war because you have these two very different systems. The Russian system, which is based on, I guess, I don't know if you want to say like nepotism and plutocracy and just, buy your positions. And the Japanese system, which is based on merit. And you go into the military seeking to improve yourself. And the Japanese beat the Russians at every single turn in how they manage the war and their logistics, in their tactics, in how people on the ground can actually, make decisions.
Yeah,
the Battle of Tsushima as a naval battle that is 18 months in the making, and the Japanese obliterate that fleet in 2 days' time, or send them packing to neutral ports. It's pretty fascinating. But I think, I don't know, 20th century wars, for the longest time, I'd say the Civil War bored me. But as I learn more about it, I kind of get it. But it's probably got to be one of those.
Yeah.
As far as battles, I don't know. I love D-Day. I think that's such a fascinating one. But I think, Operation Cowboy is pretty amazing. The Battle of Itter Castle, they're interesting. Yeah, that's a tough question.
Tough in the fact that you have to narrow it down.
Yeah, I can't narrow it down.
I think it's kind of like, when you think about like the Russo-Japanese War, I don't necessarily have a dog in that fight. Like, I'm not.
Oh, I'm rooting for Japan hard.
But like as an uninterested party, I'm not like, boy, I'm really glad that the Russo-Japanese War shook out the way it did. But I think it's just a fascinating conflict to read about and to learn from. And so when I say favorite, I think about it that way. Like, I mean, I guess if you were to say my favorite war, yeah, it'd probably be the Civil War because it held the Union together. But like that, the Russo-Japanese War is one unknown by the vast majority of people in America today. And yet it's really, really important because it shaped the next two conflicts incredibly. And there's so many lessons that were to be learned from that conflict that weren't learned, or they were learned the wrong way. Like the only time the Russians really stood a chance is when they were entrenched in some sort of defense. But, and the Japanese were just like attack. And there's a whole lot of other stuff going on there. And so you kind of had this like early blitzkrieg, but then you also saw the beginnings of trench warfare shaking out, which all came 10 years later in World War I. But none of the observers, like the French or English or American observers, took those lessons. Like they didn't see that shaking out, and they learned the wrong lessons from that. And I think that's what makes it such a fascinating war conflict to read about.
What about you?
Me personally? Again, it is tough to narrow it down. But as a kid, I really enjoyed reading about World War I and just really enjoyed World War I. And it's probably still one of my favorite ones to read, although because of my job, I'm more World War II focused. I mean, do a lot of stuff with World War II. And again, I know I'm at an advantage. But favorite battle that it's actually called a war, and it was really, there's only one casualty in it. It's called the Pig War.
I don't know. You'll have to remind me.
Sounds familiar.
Truthfully, unless you're from the Pacific Northwest, you're never going to hear about this. Bottom line is in Washington State on the San Juan Islands, on San Juan Island, actually, near where Friday Harbor is today, there was a British and an American camp. British in the north, Americans in the south. And they were debating about how to divide up the islands because the 39th parallel divided the two, Canada and the United States, quite well. Mm-hmm. Except when they got to these islands. The Brits said it should be all ours. The Americans said, no, it should be all ours. And then there was a compromise where they split the islands in half. And the Americans get some, Brits get some. Well, they were having a neutral conflict about this when a pig kept breaking into an American farmer's crops. Mm-hmm. And he told the Brits, keep the pig under control or I'm having me some bacon and eggs. Well, guess what? He had him some bacon and eggs. And the conflict eventually boiled over to you have about, I think it's around 1,000 to 2,000 American militia armed and ready at the bottom of the island. And you have about 3,000 or 4,000 Brits, regular British army, armed and ready at the north part of the island. Believe it or not, George Pickett is the captain selected to come up to Bellingham, Washington, and help lead the troops. So there's the Civil War connection, but it gets a little wild there. This goes on for like decades. I'm not joking. They are pissed off at each other for decades about a freaking pig. It's almost as bad as going about Jones's ear, or Jenkins' ear. So it gets to the point where Kaiser Wilhelm of World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm, his grandfather comes over to be the arbitrator of the conflict. And the Brits were actually for it because they thought, oh, he's got a connection to the royal family. He'll vote for us. Nope. He voted for the Americans.
Yeah.
So that's how it's one of those, this is so ridiculous to call it a war because the only casualty is a pig.
Well, that kind of reminds me of
I mean,
I don't remember. The Connor
George
Johnson
didn't have 12,000 infantry.
Yeah.
So
no, this is he's a captain for the American Army at this time.
Yeah. What was the I don't know what it was called, but the turf war between Michigan and Ohio.
Oh, yeah.
I don't remember what it was called, but basically it was one of those other. I don't think anybody died in that either. There might have been a minor skirmish where some people got hurt, but nobody died.
The Toledo War?
That might have been it, the Toledo War. But the resolution was that Ohio got this extra northern strip of their land so they could have a connection to the Great Lakes. And then Michigan gets all of the UP. And Wisconsin, as a consolation prize, gets Washington Island, which is this tiny little island off the peninsula. But yeah, it's just one of those. The way that the growth of the continental U.S. shook out in some really interesting ways, with these random skirmishes and debates over what state gets what territory, or in this case between the British and America over this island.
Yeah, well, that reminds me, when you're talking about the Toledo War, are you familiar with it wasn't really a war, it was called a battle, but it happened over a few years to establish the border of New Jersey and New York, where it is now. The militias would go to blows about this because New Jersey looked at one treaty, New York looked at another, and finally the King George weighed in and said, you know what, screw this. I'm going to hire 2 land surveyors, and they're going to go establish the permanent line. And those land surveyors' names, I bet you know them.
I don't know.
Washington.
Mason and Dixon.
Oh my God. Really?
Yeah. That's where we get the Mason-Dixon line.
That's where we get it from.
They were the surveyors of establishing what is now the border between New Jersey and New York, where they meet.
Well,
that
line is pretty far north from what I assume is the Mason-Dixon line, right? That's not it.
It's not the origination of what they used in the Civil War, but it is the origination of the name.
The name Mason-Dixon.
Yeah. Although my favorite story of history recently is when a farmer accidentally moved the border of France and Belgium.
It's not hard.
He moved he picked up a rock, right? Yeah. I remember reading about that. And it was with the whole thing. It's because he was plowing his fields or something, and it got in his way, and he had to move it. And
ended up giving, I think it was Belgium, 3 extra meters of land.
Yeah.
See, that's the one I love is that.
Give them a meter, they'll take a kilometer.
Yeah.
It's France, so I'm not really worried.
That was awesome. Maddie wants let in, Eric. I don't
know who that is. I don't know who that is.
All right, here's another good question. What is the most random piece of useless history knowledge you possess?
All of it.
I don't know if any of it's useful.
When I say random piece, you pull this out to win bar bets.
Oh gosh.
Well, just a reminder that every conversation we have here is very much like my bachelor party. So
very similar.
Mine was at a huge arcade in Seattle, so
that sounds fun.
Yeah, it was. I had a buddy I've known since I was about 14, 18 months old. He and I and a couple other guys. There used to be this huge arcade in Seattle. I don't even know if it's still there. But they had this one game where you got strapped into the seat, and it was 3 stories tall, and you fought your way up through windows like you were in a rappelling situation. They would pull you up and down the windows on how well you shot the enemy in the windows.
Okay.
But I mean, really random. Nobody else in the world knows this except you and the people you tell it to in a drunken escapade.
Oh gosh,
okay.
I don't know if I have that. Go ahead, Eric. If you have
the War
one.
of the Oaken Bucket.
Oh, that's a good one.
I've actually heard of it, but I don't know the story.
So it was between 2 city-states in Italy, and again, they're kind of escaping me. But it was the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, which were the 2 factions in the 1300s that one faction wanted the Pope to choose bishops, the other faction wanted the Holy Roman Emperor to choose bishops. And these 2 city-states, they're within marching distance of each other. And there's a fortress that's basically an abbey. and one of the city-states took the abbey from the other, and then they went and fought a battle between them. The side that won took a water pail from the well of the other city and kept it as a trophy. And so some stories say it was started because they stole the bucket, but the bucket was the trophy at the end of the war. And I mean, the city-states are like 20 miles from each other. So
was the bucket full of wine? Because that would make a reason in Italy to go to war.
Just a bucket. Just
a bucket.
And it's not why they went to war. But yeah, that's a little one. You know, I often have little tidbits from like D-Day. Like there's the story, which I'm not sure if it's corroborated or not, of the Korean soldier that was captured at D-Day fighting for the Germans, who the Germans had captured from the Russians. The Russians had captured from like the Chinese had captured him from the Japanese had captured him from Korea.
It's just a terrible way to get your passport stamped.
He had just been put into service for each of those groups. Or the fact that, what was his name? Denny Bretheridge is the first Allied casualty on D-Day, died shortly after midnight at Pegasus Bridge.
Mm-hmm. So. Oh, here's one. I don't know if it's not necessarily like the most random fact, but thinking back about the Russo-Japanese War, the Battle of Tsushima, one of the reasons the Japanese were so easily able to basically sneak up on the Russian fleet as they were going through the Strait of Tsushima is that they had a hospital ship, the Russians did, and all the other ships were supposed to keep their lights off, basically, but the hospital ship wasn't, because they didn't want to get shot, and so they lit up so that they would know, oh, this is a hospital ship, we're not supposed to attack this one. And because of that, the Japanese are like, well, there's that ship, I bet we can find all the other ones now. Like, they were trying to sneak through at the dead of night, and they couldn't because they had one ship lit up like a beacon for the Japanese to ping in on. So, like, I don't know. That's how my random history facts work, is when we talk about one thing, some random thing will pop up in relation to it. I don't know if I have one zinger that I win bar bets with. At least not one I can think of off the top of my head.
No, having served and done that, the sheer stupidity of people during times of conflict never ceases to amaze me.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliance and stupidity, I should say.
Yeah. I mean, the concept makes sense. We want you to see who we are so you don't attack us, but then that destroyed, I mean, there's a bunch of other issues, but that led to the Russian fleet getting just destroyed because they might have made it through had that not happened.
Oh, man. That's ridiculous. Oh. So you, Mr. Eric, you're an educator, correct?
I am.
And what grades do you teach?
Teach 7th and 8th grade. So my 7th grade scope is roughly the end of the 19th century American history through World War II, which I'm wrapping up this next week, and I don't know what I'm doing for the rest of the year. I got we got ahead somehow. And then my 8th grade curriculum, we do about a semester of civics, and then we do we kind of get past World War II. We start after it, talk about kind of history in Southeast Asia, Korea and Vietnam. We're just wrapping up Vietnam. And then I'll kind of jump around continentally to look at second half of the 20th century. So that's generally what I teach. So we'll look at American imperialism. We'll look at World War I. We'll dabble with the Russian Revolution. We'll get into the 20s and the Great Depression. And then World War II is a big chunk of study. So.
And Jake, am I call you Jake?
Yeah.
And what is your profession?
Well, Spartans, what is your profession? I also used to be a teacher. So Eric and I went to college together. That's where we met, was at college. And we both were going to be history teachers. And then a couple years after I graduated, Eric called me and he said, hey, there's an opening at the school he teaches at. And so I moved down to Arizona and taught middle school science. And Eric taught middle school history, and we taught other subjects. But I taught for 5 years full time. I was a sub for a couple of years before that. But yeah, I used to be a teacher. No longer. I'm not a teacher anymore. I work in an office, and
we're gonna rope you back in one of these days.
Yeah, no, he keeps trying.
I actually did spend the first 3 years of my university time in education, and then when they got into the stuff, because about the relationships, private building, it's like, you know what, I literally don't have the patience for this. I don't care why Billy hasn't called Sally back. I just don't. I don't need to hear that. I felt the same way about the privates I commanded. It's like, I told you not to go buy. I told you not to go buy that stuff, that you can't take it to AIT. Well, what am I supposed to do with it now? You got two choices: mail it or risk it not being here when you get back. Mm-hmm. I have a very short tolerance for people who bring on their own stupid mistakes, including myself.
Yeah. I mean, I loved it. I didn't choose to leave. You know, circumstances beyond my control made that happen. But, you know, and I still miss teaching. Like, I really enjoyed teaching, even middle school. And that's a tough age. But there's a lot of ancillary stuff I don't miss, like dealing with some of the admin, some of the parents, some of the non-classroom related stuff that makes it less enjoyable. But the teaching itself, I loved. And I loved working with the kids. That was awesome.
See, I probably could do it if I didn't have to put up with all that stuff you just listed.
Yeah.
Because I was told very specifically when I left the Army that throat punching is no longer an acceptable way to resolve a conflict.
Hey, yeah. I would have a blast doing artillery, but I hear there's a bunch of other stuff you have to do in the Army.
Sounds like there's some paperwork involved with that I would not want to do.
Well, here, to give you an example, when I left, I was actually qualified on every piece of artillery and mortar systems the Army military used, along with several personal weapons, all the way from the 9mm to the 50 caliber. About 36 different weapon systems I was qualified or rated expert on. When it gets to the small artillery and mortars, like 75mm, 105mm, yes, there's a lot of safety, there's a lot of math involved, but it's not terrible. You can get through it because we are taught we have to keep what we call charts and darts, which is the literal, we are hand jamming it out. We are doing it by hand because we can't, if the computer goes down, we have to still be able to.
And when I teach pre-algebra, I got to explain to kids, like, when are we ever going to use this? When you're doing artillery.
What if you're artillery in the Army?
You'll need this. I'm almost certain they use the quadratic equation.
Not in artillery, but in HIMARS we do.
See?
High mobility artillery rocket system.
Perfect.
And the reason for that is because the HIMARS system has a reach out and touch you distance of like 30 plus miles, unclassified. So not only do we have to take into effect the Coriolis effect, we also take into effect the gravitational pull on the artillery object itself and the weight distribution of the rocket, because each rocket has a different weight distribution, plus the fuel payload of it, because it reduces the weight as it turns, so that changes the trajectory of the rocket.
Yeah. It's a lot of math.
Oh, yeah.
So,
and like you said, if the computer goes down, you still got to do the math.
I hate math. So there's a reason I'm still learning that.
So you've got your medals, your badges for sharpshooter, a different rifle and pistol. Do they have a sharpshooter badge for artillery?
No, they have a you didn't kill anybody. You would laugh,
accidentally.
You would laugh, but in the late 1990s at Fort Drum, there was a horrible accident. And they dropped artillery shells in a parking lot.
Oh, gosh.
It was a parking lot for chow, thankfully not civilian. It was a parking lot for chow. They were having people congregate for chow, and they actually killed a few soldiers.
Gosh.
I feel like I remember hearing about this when I was in the news when it happened. Like, it was a big deal.
Yeah.
Like, it was a national story.
Kind of like when any bird of ours goes down. This was a big effing deal. So artillery at Fort Drum is actually taken almost as seriously as artillery at Fort Sill, which is where all artillery go to train.
And where's that?
Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Trust me, unless you're going to be artillery, there is no reason to visit Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
I've driven through Oklahoma. I trust you.
The summer I commanded basic training, we had 63 days where it did not get below, even at night, 85 degrees. Mm-hmm. 63 days of that. And by 9 a.m., it'd be over 110.
Well, I mean, Eric grew up in Arizona, and I had to live there for 13 years. So I'm familiar with that circumstance. I don't miss that at all. Now that I'm out of Arizona.
It's 10:30 p.m. It's still 105 out. That makes sense.
Yeah.
The heat is coming from the ground.
There's actually a decent reason to go to. The only reasons I would actually go back to Oklahoma is to visit the Washita battlefield and revisit Oklahoma City and go back to the Oklahoma City bombing memorial.
That's a amazing memorial.
It is. It is. The chairs are really impactful.
Yeah.
But the Washita battlefield is Custer's first last stand. He actually is losing, much like he did at Little Bighorn, because he's chasing medals of honor that his little brother has 2 of by this point. And
that's right.
Yeah, I've actually been to his brother's grave in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And he's chasing those, and he gets to the point where he knows he's going to lose. And he turns to his XO and says, "Hold the line, I'll be back," and takes a majority of his force and leaves.
Oh.
So he made it somebody else's last stand.
Yep. Geronimo's actually buried at Fort Sill, believe it or not.
Oh, is that where he was?
Yeah, that's where he still is.
Well, I mean, is that where he died? It was at Fort Sill after he surrendered?
Yeah, there's a marker where he died. He died of complications due to pneumonia after being found face partially down in a puddle in early winter.
Oh, my God.
Yep. And all the stories of him escaping the guardhouse are actually highly exaggerated. He didn't grease himself up and wiggle out the bars. Now, it's weird, but my very first unit who I actually deployed with was the 3rd ACR, and they were the last unit that captured Geronimo, and he's like, you know what, I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked about the Fort Sill accident, right? No,
that was Fort Drum.
Fort Drum accident.
There are too many at Fort Sill to list.
There's too many.
So one of the
another mark against Fort Sill.
Well, when they built the Popeyes, they found no less than 30-plus pineapple grenades that were unexploded.
Sounds about right.
Mm-hmm.
So you talk about little nuggets of history. I'm going to assume you know about the USS Forrestal incident.
That one doesn't ring a bell.
So I believe it's 1967. In I want to say July, the USS Forrestal is in the Gulf of Tonkin, and they have been, so one of the people assigned to the USS Forrestal was John McCain, and he is on deck. I think the F-4 Phantom? No, he had the A-6 Skyhawk, and they have all these planes on deck, and they're running these bombing runs in North Korea over Hanoi, and they have run out of munitions, and so they're being supplied out of a munitions depot in the Philippines, where the explosives that they've had there have been stored outside in the weather, and some of these explosives are beginning to deteriorate. But it's all the Navy can provide the USS Forrestal. So they're storing these munitions. The commander, the captain of the ship is basically saying, "Hey, you guys got to get rid of these. We need better munitions, more recently built ones." But while they're on deck preparing, a single rocket gets accidentally fired from one of the jets, hits another one, blows up the jet on deck. It's a fire. Everyone kind of starts to go to work. And then those munitions that were not properly stored exploded.
Go figure.
And so the USS Forrestal catches fire, and it gets to be pretty bad. I think they lose 7 or 8 planes, but 137 sailors and airmen are killed on this fire. And it changes the way that the Navy trains their fire suppression now. So now they have dedicated people whose job is simply fire suppression, how they handle fire suppression on deck. And John McCain was in one of the planes that was on deck when this happened. And then, of course, John McCain, about 3 months later, gets shot down over Hanoi, lands in the lake, and is
captured
POW for 5 or 6 years.
You know, now as you said that, I listened. I have 3 ways to read books. I commute and listen. I read at home and I read in the office. And one of my commuter books a few years back was John McCain's book, and he talked about that. You rang a bell as you were telling the story.
Yeah, so that's one. I try to tell a lot of these individual stories to my students as we study these different things. Try to, give them a human story that they can relate to. One of the films I'll watch with my 8th graders is Devotion, about Jesse Brown and Thomas Hudner during the Korean War. And, we watch that film. We kind of talk about that. But I also talk about, forget his rank, but it was Pitzenbarger, who was the Air Force pararescue men who came in on a helicopter, dropped in during a battle in Vietnam, and then waved the helicopter off when the helicopter had to go, and stayed with the unit that was under fire. And he was like 20 years old, this 22 years old, just a kid, waved the helicopter off, said, no, I'm going to stay with these guys. He ends up dying. He won't receive the Medal of Honor until the late 90s, I think. For his actions.
Well, yeah, the Medal of Honor, it's become a laborious thing to get the Medal of Honor now. Mm-hmm. And it's weird. It wasn't until really Korea, Vietnam that it's started to treat it with the reverence that it actually deserves.
Yeah, I mean, because it started with a failed train robbery, and
not only that, but when Lincoln did it, he just wanted something that would inspire men. I can get this medal. In fact, there's a famous story, and all these medals got rescinded, but this governor told this brigade, hey, if you all re-enlist, I'll give you all the Medal of Honor. And he did. But it was later rescinded. They were all rescinded, but it was just another medal. It was just another ribbon. They didn't mean anything. Until it started to be, World War II changed, World War I, that changed a little bit. World War II, it changed a little bit more. And you see these very, very above and beyond acts start occurring more and more and more. Because in the Civil War, go look through them. I guarantee you, in American Indian Wars, you'll see 3 things in common. Really, really short citations. Some of them will just say, in the Civil War particularly, captured such and such flag. And they got the Medal of Honor for it.
And that's how Pickett's brother got his Medal of Honor, correct? Capturing a flag?
Yeah. Or my favorite one that I've ever read was just gallantry.
Yeah.
It was one word. Now, the funny thing about him is that guy's actually buried in what is now Lakewood, Washington, but the cemetery is considered Tacoma. I think, it's Tacoma. His name is Michael McLaughlin. So I'm randomly trying to visit all the Medal of Honor recipients in Washington State. I get to this guy's cemetery. I go into the cemetery office. He's like, hey, I'm looking for this guy. I know he's in the oldest part of your cemetery. Can you tell me where he is? He's like, yeah, he's right over here. And she goes, hey, we got a file on him. They had the entire citation signed by Rutherford B. Hayes at the cemetery office. And it's just no one had seen this thing in 100+ years. It turns out his gallantry in battle was for a successful raid against Geronimo. Yeah, this is why everybody needs to go to more cemeteries.
Yeah.
It's not like they're going to get out and come talk to you.
Well, no, my wife loves cemeteries for that reason. She's also a historian, and she loves going to cemeteries. She loves looking through archives. She loves looking through all these old records because, like all this stuff we've talked about, there's so much there that if you don't look for it, you'll never realize, and that being one particular example is like, oh, this Medal of Honor recipient, yet nobody Nobody would know, you know.
When I'm going next month with our 8th graders to DC, and we go to Arlington, and last year we get a wreath, and we take the wreath to like the World War II Memorial. We take it to the California pylon, and we put it there. Last year I said, can we do something different? Because I had watched Devotion with my students, and Thomas Hudner had received the Medal of Honor. We had seen his story. I said, hopefully this sticks with you. So we went to Arlington, and I said to our tour guide, I said, let's I want to go over to this section, forget which section, 78 or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And I took my students, and we went to just a regular grave, right? All the stones are the same from a certain year on. And we go over there, and I hand the wreath to one student. I said, can you go put it by that gravestone? And they do, and they look down, and then I hand my phone to another student. I said, can you read this? And I had a student read Thomas Hudner's citation for what he did to earn the Medal of Honor. And, the students stood around, and they all kind of clicked. Like, oh, yeah, we remember this. And it's not one of these, it's not the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. It's not Washington's grave. It's not anything spectacular other than this stone has the Medal of Honor device on it, and a name that they recognize. And then we have that story, that citation, which is a well-written one, right? It's not for gallantry. It lists out everything that happened, the circumstances, what he did. And that was a really good moment for 8th grade students to have.
A good one you might want to think about visiting is there's a woman buried there. She retired a lieutenant colonel. Her name is Lieutenant Colonel Virginia Rita Rourke. She is one of the first 4 women in history to receive the Silver Star.
That's in Arlington?
She's in Arlington. Her name is Rita Virginia Rourke. Rourke, I believe.
Mickey Rourke.
Yeah, and she was a retired lieutenant colonel. She's one of the first 4 women. Herself, Lieutenant Ellen Ainsworth, who received it posthumously, and why am I blanking on their names? But I can see the picture of them getting it. Ellen Ainsworth is actually up for an upgrade to the Medal of Honor in her Silver Star. But they were at the Battle of Anzio, and Ellen and her partner were part of the 53rd Evacuation Hospital, where Rita and her partner, God, it pisses me off, I can't remember the names, were part of the 33rd Evacuation Squadron, and all 4 of them refused to leave their patients who couldn't be moved from the shelling. And they kept tending to their patients while they were going. And the story is that Ellen threw herself in front of patients when shrapnel was coming down and suffered severe wounds to her back and chest. And eventually she was slowly suffocating. But she refused to be evacuated. By the time they finally got her to render aid, it was too late. She was going away.
She was Elaine Rowe is from Whitewater, Wisconsin.
Elaine Rowe, that's one. Yeah, Rowe. And Elaine Rowe, Rourke, Ainsworth, and the third one, gosh darn it. I'm researching them for funsies too. That's it. Yeah, there's a very famous picture of the 3 survivors getting their Silver Stars. But Rita is she is the only one buried in Arlington.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up. Wow.
Yeah.
Right.
But what's interesting is, you guys ever heard of the Gold Dust brothers of World War II from the Coast Guard?
Mm-mm.
No, I have not.
Have you heard of Raymond Evans or Douglas Moreau?
Mm-mm.
Douglas Moreau is the only Coast Guard recipient of the Medal of Honor, and he's actually buried in a little town called Cle Elum, Washington.
Okay.
Yeah, tiny little town. My school used to compete against them. We're talking like 80 kids a graduating class.
I mean, I guess it's probably harder to win the Medal of Honor with the Coast Guard just because you're not sent to active war zones. I'm not knocking like it's not dangerous and like I think it's awesome, but like
it's going to be hard in the Space Force.
It's got to be harder. Whereas like the Marines and the Army, like are in a hot zone.
Who do you think drove the boats during the invasions of D-Day, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa?
Was it the Coast Guard?
It was the Coast Guard.
That's awesome.
This was actually at Guadalcanal, and Raymond Evans was piloting the boat. Moreno was on the 50 cal, and the Marines, including Chesty Puller, were trying to get the heck off Guadalcanal because they're getting overrun by the Imperial Japanese. And so they wedged their boat up onto the beach. Yeah, My Little Pony. I have kids.
Mm-hmm. Are you good?
Yeah, I have to rebuild those like every night. And so they wedged their boat to protect the Marines from the Imperial Japanese, and Moreno just starts laying down 50 caliber fire, and Evans is just feeding him ammunition. He got the Navy Distinguished Cross out of it. Mm-hmm. And Moreno's last words to Evans were, "Did they all get off?" And Chesty Puller has gone on record as saying he owed his life, and all his Marines owed their lives to those two guys because they protected them while they were getting evac from Guadalcanal.
That's cool.
So it's one of those that actually brings me to another really interesting point. What is the largest amphibious assault in modern military history?
Modern?
Oh my God. Was it the Battle of Gallipoli?
No, it's
modern military history.
No, it's
modern?
War. No, it's not. I forget the name of it. But
I'll give you a hint. It was in World War II.
I mean,
and it wasn't D-Day, and it wasn't Iwo Jima.
Pacific or European theater?
Well, if I tell you that would give it away.
Well, yeah, I'm looking for hints.
Was it the Battle of North Africa? Okay.
Not
what is
Operation
it?
Torch, Operation Husky?
Love Day, Okinawa.
It was Okinawa. Okay.
D-Day had about 155,000. Okinawa had 183,000.
Well, D-Day, you can't even count the 155 as amphibious because about 25 were aerial, right?
True, but if you count even that, you're still around 150, 155. We took seven divisions to invade Okinawa, 3 divisions to invade Iwo Jima. It was at the point of the war where basically we were not going to play the F around and find out game anymore. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Okinawa and Iwo Jima are the top 2 medal receiving battles of the entire war. That's how psychotic it is. Okay. I think it's 1 in 3 Marines received, or 1 in 5 Marines received the Purple Heart on Iwo Jima.
Jeez.
Someone once asked me, what would you do if you take a metal detector to Iwo Jima? It's like, I won't, because the thing would just be constantly going off.
It'd just be a continuous beep. Yeah, it'd be pinging everywhere.
Being there is really cool. We actually had authorization to go into the tunnels, and I got to go through 1,100 meters of tunnels on Iwo Jima that the Japanese used. But here's the funny thing. The very first time I had to do it, my boss had to go do something else because he was going to train me on how to do it. And he says, hey, Evan, don't worry, you'll be fine. Just follow the ropes. Follow the ropes. Or follow the rope. No, I'm thinking, okay, cool. There's one rope, like yellow, something that I can see very clearly. No problem. Get down in there. There are no less than 18 ropes. And not all of them are going in one direction. They're all going different directions. The whole thing smells like a rotten egg mixed with a cow fart because of all the sulfur. And I'm down there, and no one behind me, of the 60-odd people behind me, knows that I have no clue where I'm going in these tunnels.
You would have been a great teacher. That you just fake it until you make it. That's
when I saw the exit, I was like, oh, okay, good.
Yeah, we're good, guys.
Yeah, that's how I feel when I see summer around the corner. I'm like, oh, I'm almost there. Just keep going.
We got through.
I'm sitting there at the very end. It's like, okay, how many did I go in with? 1, 2, 3, 4. Wait, I'm too short, guys. We're too short. And then they come out. It's like, oh, thank God. The worst time is when we had to take the special operations guys, because they were literally wandering in the tunnels off the tour. And we ended up waiting like 15 minutes for them to find their way back. We're in there running around looking for them. It's like, oh my God, guys. I get you're special, but please stop being that special.
All right. Well, I got to bid you guys adieu. It's getting late over here.
Yeah. You have a comment about Sicily down there.
I think it was.
Oh, he was guessing the amphibious battle.
Oh, yeah, it was big. Well, it was a pleasure to finally meet you, gentlemen, somewhat face to face.
You too, Evan.
Please feel free to find me anytime. If you find me in my office, I have a lot more cool things in there to show you.
All right. Well, and now that I can do lives with Eric, we'll probably be doing these more regularly. So feel free to jump on anytime we are.
I will do that. I do have one question for Eric, though, before you guys head out. Have you ever been to the Civil War battlefield out there?
Out in where?
I believe it's Arizona or New Mexico.
Well, there's
a Civil War battlefield.
Oh, the Picacho Pass or
Picacho Peak.
Yeah,
I've camped at Picacho Peak before I knew there was a battle. Yeah, and I've been where I live in California. We're close to Fort Tejon, which was shut down before the Civil War, and it was housed the Dragoons up in the Tejon Mountain between Los Angeles and the Central Valley. So I've done trips there with students when I taught 5th grade. It's a neat site. They don't have the right resources to really make that place as good as it could be. But it's I've been there and I've been to Picacho Peak. Yeah.
Interesting. See, Washington just doesn't have that depth of history. We've only been a state for a little over 100 years. I mean,
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, hasn't been settled in the way that Arizona was settled. Arizona's only been a state since 1912, so it's a 48th state, and so
yeah. Just the western part of the United States, particularly the Pacific Northwest and the Southeast, the depth of history isn't there like it is in the East Coast.
Yeah.
When I say history, I mean white history.
Right? Yeah, obviously. Well, and with Arizona and California, you had the Spanish there, from the 1500s, and so there's all those missions and all this other European history there that adds to what was there as well. But no, I agree. It's funny. The farther east you go, the more, rich that history is, when we think of like, Philadelphia, New York and all those cities, but then you cross the pond and like, those are baby cities.
Yeah. The hotel I stayed at when I went to England, in 1998, it was the Mermaid Inn, and it was refurbished in, like 1452, like refurbished, not rebuilt, refurbished. So
yeah,
went to the Netherlands to repatriate a part of B-17 this past May. The first night we were there, a place called Huren, and we stayed in this church that was originally built in the 1400s. Yeah. It's now a hotel.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess that's how you roll.
Just a little bit ago. So
yeah. Well, I'll let you guys go. It's a pleasure to meet you both.
You as well.
You too, man. It was good talking.
Yeah, let me know if you're ever up here. I'll give you a really neat tour of JBLM.
All right. I'm down.
Potentially going to teach in Bremerton, but I turned it down. So
I would go Bremerton.
Oh, Navy shipyard there. All right. We'll catch up another time. It's getting late here too.
All right. Have a good night, gentlemen.
All right. You too.